Wherever we engage with media, there we find digital imagery. Its ubiquity grows on and comprises our culture. Learning models, colloquially and mistakenly dubbed AI, have sealed the reign of the digital in the realm of visual aesthetics. In the past, I have been, perhaps, too delicate in expressing my opinions about the integration of digital imagery. My essay, Realism and Fantastic Cinema, began my discussion of this topic. The thinking has often gone, well, if it's used right, it's fine. This is the same coping mechanism made by many who cannot properly articulate all of the nagging caveats that arise regarding digital imagery. Rather, the question must be asked, what are those proper uses? Yet, as it's taken over the imagery of art, cinema, and everything in between, it's depleted any such generosity I may have had towards it, and ultimately such diplomatic entreats to its acolytes feel hollow. I now feel animosity towards its look and what it has done to the visual impact of illustration and cinema, two areas which I feel the most strongly towards. Of course, it goes beyond those mediums. This movement comes down from a progressively technocentric mindset that sees art's intrinsic value being improved by advancements in the tools, and further, that we must soon be freed from those tools. The perfection of handmade craft, meanwhile, is thrown away for a clawing towards an aesthetic approach that can only be described as Gnostic. By Gnostic, I mean simply the belief which holds that the material world is irredeemable and anything escaping that is the only proper course for humanity. This is visible in the very way that digital technology has been applied to the arts. All imperfections, the unpredictable elements inherent in paint and celluloid and the physical world at large, are to be transcended and conquered by the utter predictability and programmability of the digital realm. Every art form has entered that realm and been altered by it. This is not to say that any use of digital technology in art making is disdainful. My own practices often involve digital coloring and mediums in order to reach an audience quicker. That expediency is a double-edged sword. Even this video essay format is one of the only methods I have of reaching most people out there. Yet with physical materials on display, my aim is for the work to always harken back to the human hand, and to make the digital aspect as invisible as possible. In cinema, we can see how the advent of digital compositing has served visual effects better, maintaining image quality and color when combining multiple elements. The key word should be evident though. They serve. Too much, vastly too much, of what computers have become in film is the master, to whom armies of evidently mistreated and underpaid animators are its slaves. The tool should serve the final product, if the intent is for the tool to not become the final product, as in computer animation. Before I proceed, I would point out that there are very few scenarios where CGI, as CGI, is well utilized in a context involving live action. Tron stands out as one of these exceptions because of how unearthly the CGI appeared in that film. Emulation of reality was not the aim, no matter what the boneheaded criticism of it keeps asserting. To tell parts of that story, it only made sense to use computers. Never mind that the bulk of the computer world in that film was made through traditional methods, in quite unique fashion. But this element is often overlooked when the film is considered for its significance. This limits what CGI should be, and I think that's all for the best. It is better for us to find creative solutions to bringing certain images to the screen through physical materials. This in turn should be serviced by the computer in calculation, preconception, or fabrication, in order that the final physical product be better. Yet, even back when Tron was released, there was an immense push from companies developing imaging systems to integrate this into films. When it happened early on, it was often seen as a curiosity, as with The Last Starfighter. With that movie, it is a wholly different scenario from the purpose of the CGI in Tron. Starfighter uses it in lieu of models to portray things in the real world of the story. The Last Starfighter is constantly noted as a groundbreaking and innovative film for its bold use of computer special effects. But why? Why was it imperative that computers resolved issues which were already being solved by traditional special effects? Was it simply because all the work and craft and artistry of traditional effects took so much time and effort and money? On the contrary, at the time and even now, having Hollywood-level CGI in a film was more time and labor-intensive than the process of rendering imagery with models and photographic methods. The only people getting a break were the traditional effects men. The work just went elsewhere. One reason as to the drive for CGI's dominance, besides the commercial, was that very American artistic obsession with realism. The idea that art must be immersive for the viewer has rolled on since the likes of Thomas Eakins and 19th century realist painting, right into The Great Train Robbery, the first Nickelodeons, and on to Saving Private Ryan. There is something highly materialistic in this approach, where textural veracity and awareness of the camera are the markers of serious filmmaking. Couple all this with a blind run into whatever new technology is at hand, and damn the repercussions. As the silent cinema came into its own and was perfected by its creators, others considered it incomplete without sound. The closed unreality of the form was considered a flaw to be overcome with technology. Thus, sound was hurtled into and further reality was achieved. Never mind the death of a previous iteration of the art form or the mass suicides and ruined careers that resulted. This approach to immersion was not always adhered to, especially in the realm of the fantastic. Take George Méliès' A Trip to the Moon or The Wizard of Oz. The latter two feel like live-action cartoons at times. Yet after World War II, after television, and especially after 2001: A Space Odyssey, the emphasis on realism that had defined literature eventually defined the new Hollywood and changed the way fantastic cinema was treated. As fluffy as its story was, the grit of Star Wars and its visual style further married special effects to the pursuit of realism. Though there were examples at the time that had interludes into the strange, such as The Black Hole and Star Trek the Motion Picture. It is quite fitting, then, that George Lucas would become the future patron saint of CGI, not only because of his notorious overuse of it in the Star Wars prequels, but also because he was directly responsible for the formation of the company Pixar, whose films would spark a trend that would raise the field of hand-drawn animation and condemn it to a ghettoized and pale form of its former self. Ultimately, realism and a perfect integration of the special effect with live action became the dogged goal of all visual effects in Hollywood. Outside, there was some latitude into the poetic and abstract, as with Japanese effects films. Japan has treated CG differently and almost lean into the juxtaposed and phony quality of those effects. Of course, these films are often derided for such evident phoniness by Western or American audiences. The reason that I believe accounts for such derision on more unrealistic approaches is due to the paradigm we are mired in, realism as the goal of art. The irony is that in this pursuit of realism, many filmmakers eschewed the use of real physical materials, provided by our Creator, for the making of their imagery. Integrating new technology to serve the use of real materials should be the end goal of well-prepared innovation, but many filmmakers became stuck along the path, and found that which was meant to serve irresistibly enticing in its amorphous potential. Just think of James Cameron and the course his Avatar movies set the industry towards. Filmmakers like him didn't seem to question the flight to the digital realm. In the latter case, it seemed a matter of philosophy. Nor did they see the real implications it had for art. It has led us to the fallacious and soul-robbing detour of CGI. When digital imagery is combined with limitless camera movement, it becomes less about the image and more about the immersion. Less about composition and indelibility as direct experience. And because of this, I feel led to make a statement. Computer-generated images rob us of our imaginations. There is no gestalt between what is being presented by that medium and the minds of the audience. In literature, the engagement of the reader's imagination is near total. In radio, it flowers wonderfully. In comics, the gutters between panels are where the mind truly activates. In film and its pre-digital realizations of the fantastic and extraordinary, It is the limitations and the cutting around these embellishments that conjure impressions in our mind unique to each of us, that complete or compensate for what isn't seen, or for any shortcomings in what is seen. The latter is true with the proviso the viewer is of a participatory mind, in other words, someone who can suspend their disbelief. CGI limits true participation. Ignore the never-ceasing deluge of talk about how immersive it is. What it does is only to fill in all the gaps of perception. In those sequences where the film would cut away from a traditional effect, our imagination continues it and links it up to whenever it may appear again. CGI tyrannically envisions, in the most free-flowing, granular way, how something fantastic takes place, and in doing so dulls the audience's imagination because they no longer have any missing pieces to construct in their heads. Everything unfolds on screen. This is the great mistake of CGI, the thinking that providing so much will make images as meaningful as those before its advent. In reality, we have attained numbness and meandering dross. The endless piling on of layers upon layers create visual slop, brightly colored or not, and smeared across the screen. On the other hand, the technique for practical and model effects escalated and reached a glossy zenith in the 80s and 90s. Those shots become infinitely more readable compared to sequences from a new blockbuster, which come across as cloying theme park rides. Why then does it matter that something is rendered in a physical manner, as opposed to a digital one? I will quote one of my favorite practitioners of stop-motion animation. Perhaps my fate would have been significantly different if it had been CGI that had brought Kong to life. I might not have been so inspired and could have ended up as a plumber. Three-dimensional stop-motion model animation created a fantasy world that was so rare. The way the creatures moved encouraged a sense that one was watching a miracle, but when the miraculous becomes commonplace, the concept of the miracles cease to be miraculous. The thinking that an advancement in technology means better art has been constantly spoon-fed to us, often as an added attraction that promises unseen wonders. Older films promised this too, and delivered often a slow but savory stream. Large-scale digital effects turned that fountain into a fire hose. When CGI became ubiquitous, it was as if suddenly the craft and skill and years of perfecting physical and photochemical techniques could gladly be thrown by the wayside. Many directors and effects men have told stories of how hard it was to make movies before computers, and often you'd find those same people falling into an over-reliance on the newest tech. It is as if anything done before was redundant and unnecessary. That sentiment gets picked up by the next generation. Art making itself, in that sense, is treated like any other function of machinery. It's not built to last, it's built to be today's interest and tomorrow's garbage, on the path to something. Total immersion? Relinquishing the act of creation itself to LLMs would seem to point that way. It would seem that the century of work and knowledge was all just stepping stones to the threshold of this immaterial digital realm. The results speak for themselves. As a digression, the field of illustration has suffered a great deal from the impact of digital imagery. This is not news. Many often lament the disappearance of inspiring book covers, as well as posters. I am dismayed whenever I see such covers with stock textures layered over uninspired but easy-to-achieve designs. With the simulated textures, this kind of design aims to emulate the real, or in the physical, in a sort of book illustration in drag. It's a hyper-accelerated devolution caused by access to programs like Adobe Illustrator. It's a situation that can only be described as consumer-driven aesthetics. Traditional methods, by that I mean physical ones, be they drawing, painting, sculpture, had gone on for millennia and still go on, though not unaffected. Film itself didn't take long to be fully developed as a visual language, with variations within the medium like animation. Then, suddenly, digital cinema canned, essentially, the continuation of that medium within itself, as surely as sound did so for the silence on a mainstream commercial level. Fine arts had been allowed to move and permutate and assume various movements within and without the parameters of the tried and tested methods. Traditional filmmaking was denied a similar future. And it's not just for money. A big reason, simply enough, seems to have been ease and expedience, and not a love for the kind of ingenuity that had preceded CGI. I have said it before, but it demands restating. Expediency breeds mediocrity. Commercial art has become about moving away from the physical into the digital, the immaterial, which moves at lightning pace. It has come down to value being placed on that perfected realism, and achieving that method through digital methods, instead of an approach to art that masters the material, but takes more time that progress will not afford. People of a certain age often have an idea that something is missing without the use of physical and traditional effects, but it's almost the same way people soon notice that something in the fabric of society is missing without considering the necessary spiritual component via religion. This analogy may seem ironic given my critique of the rather Gnostic emphasis on digital effects, but I would point out that Christian religion is made up of both the physical and the spiritual. At this point, I'd like to contrast two different ways of applying special effects, which I will call a subordinated imagination versus a stimulated imagination. Forbidden Planet is a masterclass in the stimulated imagination, from the Krell doors that suggest the body shape of a vanished race, to the entire staging of the attack of the id monster, which found a marvelous compromise for the challenge of visualizing an invisible terror. Or compare the Medusa sequence in both versions of Clash of the Titans. Harryhausen's version is much, much slower. It's darker, literally. Torchlight is all we get, and menacing red light at that. The room has mysterious paintings and is littered with the human statues of previous victims. There is a quiet dread before we even hear Medusa. That comes by the rattle of her tail. She makes herself known by killing one of Perseus's men from a distance with an arrow. This causes a spike in sound effects, which die back down, yet the tension remains heightened. Then music comes in, brooding and deliberate. The Gorgon is mostly in shadow the whole time, and Perseus has to make calculated moves, not slide around like he's Super Mario as in the remake. The glimpses we get of her here are chilling in their suggestion, for the reason that we're not given all of her at once. The pace of this scene, and its ultimate impact, was dictated by the fact that stop-motion animation did not allow for the free-flowing camera moves as seen in the 2010 remake. A more careful type of planning was required. Not that shooting a VFX sequence in the 2010 version is complex, doesn't need as much or even more coordination. It's that the limitations of the 1981 version created a scene that works as a truly suspenseful sequence, rather than a convoluted boss fight as per 2010's scene. It's a lesson in restraint, even if that restraint was due to hard restrictions of technique. Sometimes the discourse on CGI versus practical effects can become tiresome or miss the mark entirely, especially when it's more about nostalgia than understanding the pros and cons of each approach. Lest you think I'm becoming horribly skewed in my reasoning, there is a point where practical effects can overwhelm in a similar fashion to CGI. There are several examples of this in the 80s and 90s. The Thing, as lauded as the effects are, tend to dwell far too much on the explosive gore, which was brought to life by an exuberant crew, no less. I'd also apply this to An American Werewolf in London, which took on a clinical approach to its transformation scene. It's often been noted that the 90s was a period where CGI merged with practical effects to incredible results. I would say this is somewhat true. The litany of titles like Cameron's The Abyss and Terminator 2 Judgment Day were noted for standout sequences of CG, albeit examples that visualized relatively simple materials, water and liquid metal respectively. Further, those examples had a distinct unreality to them, representing something phenomenal, breaking the rules of our material world. Jurassic Park, a few years later, showed dinosaurs with camera movements only a step above that attempted with stop-motion animation. This didn't dilute the effect those scenes had because the camera work was still restrained enough to make everything on screen recognizable as compositions to be read. Beyond the fact that CG looks better when mastered onto film, it's this compositional element that keeps people praising Jurassic Park 30 years on. Not to mention the use of practical puppets for close-ups enhanced people's sense of these monsters being tangible and formed a sort of mental retention for the wider shots. Yet for each one of those executions there were many, many embarrassments. The clamor and thrill of the new technology inevitably pushed it towards the cliff that is realism. The hype generated about CG was, I now believe, made in large part to bolster investment in Silicon Valley, computer companies, etc., all of which then became the benefactors of much of the widespread permeation of the technology in the film industry. What was promised by this permeation no doubt appealed to filmmakers, the severing of old limitations. But the loosening of limitations is not always a good thing. It's often detrimental to art. The malleability that was brought to every corner of art has turned into unrestraint, in short, chaos. There may be another reason for the widespread integration of CGI. Visual effects are easily interchangeable and consolidated. CG VFX companies can have their work moved all over, rather than working in one place. Endless variation and alteration are a temptation indulged by studio after studio, micromanaging and overworking the hordes of animators who were likely not inspired to enter the field by such prospects. People have noticed this, and films have begun to change accordingly. Many films, often smaller budgeted or those more thoughtfully constructed, use CGI with restraint and even subtlety. However, even there, the lack of something physical is still evident in the color and texture and movement of the creature or environment being visualized, a lack of real light hitting real substance. This may be a necessary trade-off because of the choice of the filmmaker or lack of access to skill in handcraft, or the fear that something done by hand would look less realistic and therefore garner the aforementioned ridicule. Just as often, fantastic or horror films set their tone as nothing less than dramatic realism, against which something unrealistic would generate friction, or worse, create comedy. Ultimately, emphasis on digital production de-emphasizes not only physical methods, but the legacies of studios in favor of what can be easily churned out. This era has been slowly eroding the history of film. For 3 decades now, CGI has meant more product for studios, and this in turn has led to a proliferation of terrible animation and visuals. If there is any consolation for the invasion of AI, it may be that animators may not be as overworked on mediocrity as before, though they will become underemployed. In a sympathetic sense, that is a bad thing, but if such a style can be easily replicated by AI, then one can see its dearth of value. Part of me marvels at some digital imagery, the more surreal, or being able to thoroughly conceptualize with it. However, CGI has become about the circumventing of natural, real-world methods of artistic expression. Removing most of the human essence of art because technology allows us to is deemed okay, while it's obvious there's a myriad of other reasons why people make art in the first place. Those reasons are not just because people have to, but because they want to, and are willing to work within the framework of the world that we have been given and its parameters. A self-imposed restraint for the sake of better art should be considered.